Ba-da-ba-da. Ba-da-ba-da. Phenomena. Hey, everybody. How you doing? Thanks for listening. Welcome to the show. This is Kooks, Cranks, and Iconoclast, the podcast. And I'm your host, Mike Lucht. And today, we are delving into a freaking labyrinth. I have to keep the first 10 minutes of the show relatively PG-13. So, it's a freaking labyrinth. A freaking labyrinth. It's a shame I can't use the actual F word I want to actually use because it's very germane to today's show. Tito! Today's episode, and for probably the next month, we're going to be talking about sexual encounters with non-human entities. And man, I went into this, just thinking like, okay, aliens, obviously. All the alien abduction lore has a reproductive theme running through it. But then, of course, you add the John Keel, Jacques Vallée sort of folklore, demonology element or aspect to that. Okay, yeah, we've kind of heard this. And then you get into the weirder, crazier, disturbing places and implications. This series, we're looking at a 4, maybe even 4.5 parter. That's how much strangeness and weird stuff I've uncovered. And I guess trigger warning. I don't know how to do these very well. But there are going to be some discussions of forceful intimacy. I don't even know what to. I can't. I don't know. It's just going to get weird and uncomfortable in a lot of places. So I'm preparing you for that shit now. So having said that, why this topic? Well, as I said, I started off with the abduction and demonology and folklore kind of parallels going into this. And I have uncovered a plethora.
Oh, yes. You have a plethora.
Of high strangeness and deep weirdness. So, let's see. Trigger warning. Deep weirdness. Got those. So what else did I need to cover here? People be horny. And that's been a fact since the start of people. And it's also what keeps our species going. It's not just about the sex, although, of course, we will be talking about that. But it's the biological imperatives, the drives underneath that make humanity a verb as opposed to a noun. We just keep on going. Makes more people. People making people. Do you want to get into the whole psychological angle on it? There's the Freudian sex and death drives. The Marilyn meets the Manson. And that's kind of what dictates our behavior and why and how we do what we do. It's all about procreation and avoiding death, or seeking it out, or whatever. However you act the way you do and behave the way you do according to those Freudian sex death drives. So, having said that, why else is this important? Well, we're going to look into, throughout this series, we're going to look into not just the strange sexual encounters with non-human entities that have been taking place as long as humanity has been around. This has been going on from the start. It may even be how we got here. We'll explore that topic. We're going to look into bloodlines and lineages. We're going to look into various aspects of this phenomenon. When we get into the... we get into the Christian demonological aspects, it's going to get real weird. We're going to look into rumors, folklore, mythology, as per usual. We're going to look into, like I said, bloodlines and lineages. We're going to look into various forms of the phenomena with various entities. We're going to look into gods, demons, angels, ghosts, aliens, of course, etc. For long-time listeners of the show, you've probably heard me throw around the phrase occult eugenics here and there. I've never really got in depth to explaining what I mean by that, but in this series, we're going to get way into it. I have found or stumbled across or just plunged into some of the weirdest sources that I've ever read. Some of the weirdest shit ever. So much, it's so weird that I don't even understand some of it. It's very technical, scientific language that I had to scratch my head extra hard to figure out what the meaning behind was. And what's extra strange about that is that these are books on occultism. So, yeah, it's weird. It's real weird. What else? Yeah, I guess basically, you may be asking yourself, why this particular topic? And, like, why sex? Why sex with non-human entities? So, this phenomena has been going on since humanity first showed up. Even before that, really. You can trace this all the way back to the first amoeba. But, what is it about sex as a activity, as an event taking place between a human and not human, whether consensual or otherwise, that has something to tell us or teach us? Why is the sexual encounter so, well, germane, as I said before? Tito! I recently got a new book. It's called The Stars That Pause by Izzy Yu, Y-U, and John U. Branscombe. They did a previous book called The Shadow Book of Ji Yun. But this book is called The Stars That Pause, and it's about several thousand years of strange, largely alien or otherworldly encounters with non-human entities. From the perspective, or from the history and records, largely in China, but there are other East Asian countries and areas as well. And I like to get these international or non-English sources as possible and get more of an international, pan-global perspective on stuff like this. And when you do, you find that everyone is basically talking about the same experience, telling the same story. I had a weird sexual encounter with a non-human entity. That's me, quoting the world. I mean, me personally, only through dreams. I had some very strange dreams in my life. But we're not here to talk about me. I'm just saying, this is a universal thing. It's happened to everyone. Even celebrities. The late Anna Nicole Smith, R.I.P.C.P. K E $ H-A. I don't know how you pronounce it. Keisha. Mrs. Ice-T, Coco, was assaulted by a ghost sexually. Who else? Nick Nolte? I don't know. I'm just throwing out names now. But that one lady even wrote a song about boning a ghost. These things happen. It's universal. And why sex? Why is sex the component, the event that is so... I mean, obviously, sex is universal, unless you're a creepy incel, in which case, you're probably not going to like this podcast anyways, because I'm a bit of a libtard, probably, in your eyes. But the idea of sex is, it's universal. It's, like I said, it's something that as long as there have been humans, sex has been around between humans. And then, of course, you get into the idea that maybe sex with a non-human entity is what got us here or contributed to our evolutionary development, genetic tampering, possibly. We're going to look at stuff like the Nephilim, etc. But sex itself, I like I said, I was talking about the book, The Stars That Pause, and I think they have a really good summary of why sex. So, it says, research from the Foundation for Research into Extraterrestrial and Extraordinary Experiences, or FREE, reveals that individuals reporting sexual entity contact frequently describe it not in terms of physical pleasure, but as an energetic communion with reported transformative after effects that run the gamut from enhanced intuition to psychic abilities that persist long after the encounter. What sense can one make of this conceptual overlap? If there is a through line, it may be that, as Dr. Jeffrey Kripal of Rice University theorizes, sexuality can dissolve the boundaries ordinarily drawn between self and other, body and spirit, opening access to broader or even cosmic states of consciousness. We don't need a cult philosophy to appreciate this point either. The everyday language of sexuality is rife with allusions with an A.
Illusion with an A, so if you guys want to put an illusion in there somewhere.
Centered on a dissolution of boundaries. Not just via the classical two becoming one or the beast with two backs metaphor, but in how sex is discussed across cultures in terms of consumption, i.e. devouring, licking, swallowing whole, or violence, splitting open, etc., and transformation, i.e. melting together, something one finds in religious language as well. Even in our daily life, sexuality can be said to operate as an advanced interface technology, a joining of biological hardware and psychological software that allows radically different forms of consciousness to connect and exchange information and sensation. This, I think that perfectly encapsulates like the idea behind why humans and non-human entities, like why a lot of these events, this phenomena happens and keeps recurring. And like I said, this will get into some weird, disturbing, sometimes very uncomfortable places. So I'm just letting you know now, be prepared for that shit because it'll pop up here and there. But, all the way back to, we're going all the way back to pre-biblical times. Like I said, the first amoeba and amoeba gal. I don't know what you'd call a female amoeba, a phomoeba. It's only in the editing process that I finally remembered amoebas have no gender. Good one. We're going to start there. I'm going to actually hit y'all with some science. First up, blended with folklore. That's what we're, for the most part, getting into in today's episode. So strap on all your protective prophylactic gear. You're going to need it. Let's do this. One last thing before we get started, I just want to give a good luck, and you got this, Mr. S. Lowry, his big old job interview. You're going to do great, man. Anywho, moving forward. Before the myths, before angels, demons, and skydaddies, there is the record of life itself. It speaks not in prophecy or scripture, but in the spiraling scripts of DNA. The double helix, that ancient and self-replicating cipher, contains the most complete autobiography of life on Earth, and also its most cryptic. Perhaps it is no coincidence that across civilizations, long before anyone could peer into a cell nucleus, cultures imagined creation, healing, and divine power as a twisting, ascending, serpentine force. In ancient Sumer, the earliest clear instance appears in the iconography of the gatekeeper deity, oh boy, here we go, Ningishzida, whose name means Lord of the Good Tree. His emblem, a central staff flanked by two coiling serpents, is one of humanity's first Tree of Life diagrams, dating to the early dynastic period around 3000 BCE, long predating Greek medicine. It already resembles a proto-caduceus, an abstracted biological spiral encoded into myth. Greco-Roman traditions preserved the motif with uncanny fidelity. The caduceus of Hermes, or Mercury, divine messenger and god of language, keep that in mind, the single serpent rod of Asclepius, emblem of healing and regeneration, even the oracular serpents of Delphi, whose intoxicating vapors induce trance and revelation, all recur within the same core geometry: life, health, power, and knowledge expressed through a coiling serpent rising along a central axis. Nearly every spiral motif is serpentine. Serpentine. Nearly all of them carry some association with vitality, immortality, transformation, or forbidden wisdom. It's not difficult to wonder why. In Indian esoteric traditions, the parallel becomes explicit. Kundalini, the coiled one, is described as a serpentine current of primordial energy sleeping at the base of the spine. Pretty close to the genitals. Close to the ginnies. When awakened through breath, meditation, ritual, or erotic discipline, it rises in a spiraling ascent through the chakras, igniting the subtle body and illuminating consciousness. Classical texts liken this movement to a pair of intertwining channels, Ida and Pingala, probably butchering those, spiraling around a central column, or Susumna, a living, energetic analog of the double helix. The quote-unquote fire serpent unites duality, harmonizes opposites, heals, transforms, and grants enlightenment. It is biology mythologized. Biology mythologized. Toy boat. Sorry. Trying to loosen up. Or perhaps mythology remembering something biology would only later confirm. Across world traditions, the same image reappears. A twisting force that climbs, awakens, heals, or creates a bridge across realms. Whether carved on Mesopotamian seals, held in the hand of a Greek god, or rising in a yogic fire. Yoga flame! Through the spine, the motif persists with almost obsessive consistency. And in every case, snakes coil, they wind, they spiral. They behave like living metaphors for the foundational architecture of life itself. Curious indeed. However, hidden within this molecular script are vast stretches of silence. Nearly 98% of the human genome does not code for proteins, long dismissed as quote-unquote junk DNA. If 98% of your DNA is strictly reserved for your junk, consider me jealous or terrified. Yet the more we study it, the less that label seems appropriate. These silent regions appear to regulate the active genes, determine how and when they are expressed, and carry faint echoes of our evolutionary past, as if storing ancestral memories in the molecular dark. Some researchers now suspect that these regions may preserve traces of long-lost lineages, symbiotic viral mergers, or even genetic material from organisms that have vanished from the record. Others, less cautious, wonder if these enigmatic sequences could be the genetic shadows of encounters that science cannot yet classify, events that myth has already described in its own way, unions between humans and something other. Our blood, too, carries its secrets. Most of humanity shares the Rh positive factor, a molecular tag that allows mother and child to peacefully coexist during pregnancy. But a small minority, perhaps 15%, lack it entirely. The origin of the Rh negative blood type remains a biological mystery. Some attribute it to archaic hominins and ancient divergence. Others whisper of something stranger, genetic fingerprint left by an encounter that predates recorded history. Anecdotally, patterns emerge, subtle physiological sensitivities, distinct cognitive traits, nothing conclusive, yet difficult to dismiss. Bloodlines, once dismissed as superstition, may in fact be carrying the faint molecular memory of something otherworldly. Mitochondrial DNA, the tiny genome housed in each cell's energy center, carries a secret long recognized not only by geneticists, but by ancient tradition. It passes solely through mothers, forming an unbroken chain across thousands of generations. In biology, this matrilineal thread allows scientists to trace every living human back to a single woman, mitochondrial Eve, who lived roughly 150,000 years ago. Yet even that lineage is not as clean or linear as textbooks suggest. Geneticists continue to identify haplogroups and anomalies that resist placement within the known fossil record. Mutations appearing suddenly, simultaneously, across global populations, as though entire genomic chapters were added to the human story without the usual transitional sentences evolution provides. Strikingly, this scientific matrilineal truth mirrors older religious and mythic models in which identity, soul status, or covenant is transmitted exclusively through the mother. Judaism's ancient legal tradition of matrilineal descent holds that Jewish identity passes only through the mother, a principle that some scholars believe emerged from earlier Near Eastern beliefs about the mother as the vessel of the child's spiritual essence. Similar ideas appear elsewhere. In certain strands of Hindu and Tantric cosmology, the maternal bloodline carries the Shakti, spiritual energy or animating force inherited from primordial goddesses. In Tibetan Buddhist mother lineage teachings, empowerment is transmitted through female incarnations. And in some African and indigenous American traditions, the maternal line is seen as the keeper of ancestral spirits, dreams, and the hidden history of a people. When placed beside these mythic frameworks, the quirks of mitochondrial genetics take on an uncanny resonance, as though science and folklore were both circling the same mystery of our origins, transmission, and the unseen forces that shape who we are. Ancient astronaut theorists, take a shot, have seized on mitochondrial DNA's uniqueness as potential evidence for deliberate genetic intervention in early human evolution. Because mitochondrial DNA is small, easily modified, and responsible for cellular energy regulation, arguably a critical threshold for increasing cognitive capacity. Some ufological interpretations suggest that is precisely where an advanced species would have introduced subtle changes. The sudden appearance of new mitochondrial haplogroups without clear transitional ancestors is framed by these theorists as a quote-unquote signature of past contact, a quiet insertion into the maternal line that would ripple forward into all future generations. Under this lens, mitochondrial Eve becomes not merely an ancestral human woman, but a genetic bottleneck event engineered to stabilize or reboot the species. A scenario occasionally linked to the Sumerian myths of Ninhursag or the Anunnaki, crafting humankind with divine essence. This also mirrors many Gnostic beliefs, wherein the spark of divinity is in every human. More speculative abductee and hybridization narratives, particularly those examined by Bud Hopkins, David Jacobs, Valerie Barrow, and contemporary contactees, also reframe the mitochondrial inheritance as the key to understanding why extraterrestrial beings focus on female abductees. Jacobs' abductees, and I've stated before, I do have issues with people like Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs. It's not them. They do great work. They help people. Or do they? It's hypnosis that I'm very wary of. But I digress. Jacobs' abductees often describe procedures centered on the ovaries, womb, or ova extraction. Hopkins documents repeated patterns of intergenerational female selection, which he interprets as part of a long-term breeding program. So in this ufological mythos, the maternal line becomes the gateway through which non-human intelligences insert, modify, or preserve traits designed for future hybrid offspring. The fact that mitochondrial DNA is exclusively maternal plays directly into this logic. If you wanted to alter humanity subtly yet permanently, you would begin with the mothers. Call your mother. Ensuring that every descendant carries the introduced changes. Some ancient alien theorists, take a shot, go even further, arguing that global myths of divine or luminous beings impregnating human women, ranging from Greek gods to Mesopotamian Apkallu to Chinese dragon ancestors, may encode cultural memories of interventions in the maternal line. In this view, mitochondrial Eve is not merely the mother of all humans, but the first successful or stabilized version of Homo sapiens after a period of experimental modification. While mainstream biology rejects such interpretations, the symbolic resonance between the maternal exclusivity of mitochondrial DNA and long-standing mythical structures surrounding divine maternity, immaculate conception, or quote-unquote chosen bloodlines remains striking and forms a powerful bridge between ancient mythology and modern ufology. And then there's evolution itself, one of our most trusted modern scientific narratives, which is full of inexplicable leaps. For nearly 2 million years, hominids chipped stone and scavenged bones. Their world was simple, and their minds were unchained by what we might today call self-awareness, quote-unquote. Some of these primitive beings still exist to this very day. We all know at least one. But then, almost as if overnight, you have art, language, funerary rites, music, mythology, the cognitive revolution, anthropologists call it. The moment the light switched on. Interbreeding with Neanderthals and Denisovans explains some of it, but not the speed nor the scope. Our brains rewired themselves far faster than natural selection should allow, naturally leading to the assumption that someone, or something, may have accelerated the process. Modern biology offers its own echoes of this possibility. Horizontal gene transfer, long believed confined to microbial life forms, has been detected in mammals, even humans, as genes occasionally jump between species via viruses or symbiotic cells. It's a natural form of genetic communication, a silent rewriting of the code. Evolution, in this sense, is not linear, but conversational. Once again, a language. An ongoing exchange of information across the boundaries of species, time, and perhaps, even realities. Nature, it seems, has always been experimenting with hybridization in one form or fashion. If evolution can leap and genes can migrate, then what about deliberate intervention? Last I checked, panspermia has become the most logical idea as far as the origins of life. In the 21st century, we've learned to edit the genome with CRISPR, to splice traits across species, create luminous monkeys, or awaken the dormant genes and silence others. We are, in a way, beginning to reenact the very myths once ascribed to gods. Altering the flesh, crafting hybrids, shaping life. And epigenetics adds another layer still. Trauma, love, environment, even memory can shape genetic expression, carried forward across generations. What our ancestors suffered or desired may still live within us, written in a chemical code. It lends scientific form to the ancient idea of inherited curses, divine favor, or karmic legacy. Within this framework, humanity begins to resemble a self-modifying project, an experiment in progress. That's right, we've almost caught up to the octopus.
I am the octopus.
Mutations like FOXP2, linked to speech and language, or microcephalin, tied to brain growth, appear in our species as abrupt insertions, as if downloaded rather than evolved. Tiny alterations that changed everything. The mythic idea of gods or star beings teaching humanity language may reflect something more literal. A neurological upgrade
with 2 Ds
that made symbolic communication possible. Then again, to quote the modern-day patron saint of science, Carl Sagan, "We're all made of stars." Even our own developmental biology carries mythical fingerprints. In the womb, every human embryo passes through an aquatic stage, growing gills and a tail before the body decides otherwise. These vestigial echoes of evolution hint at a memory deeper than culture, a physical recollection of having once emerged from the sea. Our earliest ancestors were amphibians, our very cells still saline. Is it any wonder that so many origin myths speak of sea gods, mermaids, or amphibious teachers ascending from the deep?
I am the octopus.
The Dogon people of Mali tell of the Namo, or Namo, fish-like beings who came from Sirius to educate humankind. A legend that eerily parallels our biological truth. Life came from water, and the stars fueled it. In alchemical texts, the androgyne represents a primordial unity of opposites, male and female combined in a single perfected form. This imagery can be read as a symbolic mirror of our earliest biological state, before sexual differentiation occurs, in the womb. In the embryonic stage, human development is initially sexually neutral. The fetus only later develops into anatomically male or female gender. Just as the alchemical androgyne embodies potentiality and completeness, so too does the undifferentiated embryo carry the full blueprint of human possibility. This correspondence between mystical metaphor and biological reality suggests that division and duality, a notion that resonates with the recurrent themes in mythology and esoteric lore of an original, unified human condition. Perhaps the idea of the biblical fall is alluding to our exit from this particular unified state. In much the same way that the single-celled organism splits in two, so was Eve made from Adam's rib. Perhaps an allegory for the process of evolution itself. Now, I'm pretty sure it's 100% literal, word for word. From a ufological perspective, the symbolism of the androgyne and the pregendered embryo takes on a cosmic dimension. Proponents of ancient astronaut theories, take a shot, and hybridization myths often posit that humanity was deliberately engineered by non-human intelligences, with the original template of human life carrying latent, undifferentiated potential. The undivided embryonic state mirrors the alchemical androgyne's unity, suggesting that early humans may have been designed, or at least imagined by the creators of mythologies, as some holistic being capable of encompassing multiple forms of identity or function. Just as the androgyne embodies latent possibility before duality manifests, so too might these ancient narratives and modern ufological interpretations hint at a sort of preordained flexibility in human nature, a genetic and spiritual openness that allows for hybridization, extraordinary abilities, or the inheritance of non-human lineages in both mythical and speculative frameworks. In nature, hybridization is rare but not miraculous. It requires a threshold of genetic compatibility that evolution alone typically can't bridge all that fast. Yet myths across cultures assume that humans can produce offspring with gods, spirits, angels, jinn, fairies, and, in modern-day accounts, aliens. Taken symbolically, these stories express the belief that humanity is permeable, unfinished, and or capable of merging with the other. Why, yes, I did just learn how to use that effect. Let me have my fun. Taken literally, they implied that something about human biology is unusually open to these external influences, It's as if our genome were built with docking ports for non-human intelligences. Ufological theorists, ancient astronaut theorists, take a shot, argue that this compatibility is the clue. Humans can be bred with visitors from the stars in abduction narratives or engineered by ancient beings in prehistoric myths, then our genetic architecture must already share deep resonance with theirs. Whether framed as divine design, that rhymed, cosmic ancestry, or the echoes of an earlier intervention of some sort, the repeated frequency of the appearance of viable hybrids suggests that humanity may not be a closed system at all, but rather a species whose boundaries were shaped, perhaps even intentionally created, by forces beyond our world. And just a quick aside, some cryptozoologist studies have taken a comparable approach to this hybrid compatibility when examining alleged Bigfoot or Sasquatch hair samples. Mainstream DNA analyses almost invariably classify these hairs as coming from known animals, or, in a few cases, actually most cases, as human. Yet the persistence of reports suggests that some observers interpret these beings not as unknown primates, but as altered humans, just changed by a prolonged life in the wilderness. This resonates with domestic pigs, reverting towards wild boar characteristics when left to the wild for generations. These accounts imply a kind of phenotype plasticity. Humans, or human-like creatures, adopting physically, morphologically, and behaviorally to extreme environments, sometimes producing appearances that blur the line between species. In this sense, the Bigfoot as humans but changed hypothesis resonates with mythical narratives of hybridization, suggesting that boundaries between human and other may be more malleable than biology traditionally allows. Interestingly, these tales also echo a long-standing motif in folklore and ufology, that humanity itself is not fixed, but genetically malleable. Just as myths imagine unions with spirits, angels, or extraterrestrials producing viable offspring, the Bigfoot hair findings, which nominally human DNA, invite speculation that environmental pressures or unseen influences can reshape human physiology. Ufologists and cryptid researchers often frame this as a subtle form of hybridization, where the quote-unquote wild environment, perhaps in combination with unknown genetic factors, produces individuals whose traits resonate with both human and non-human ancestors. In other words, the genome is flexible enough to record, reflect, or even accommodate the influence of the other, whether mythical, divine, extraterrestrial, etc. This line of thought dovetails neatly with the larger pattern, which is the repeated emergence of hybrid-like figures in myth, folklore, and modern abduction literature. Whether framed as divine visitations, angelic seductions, fairy lineage, or ancient alien engineering, the suggestion remains consistent. Humans are a vessel, biologically and culturally open to external influence. Even the mundane hair samples from forest-dwelling humans or cryptid-like beings can serve as a subtle reminder that our species has always been imagined and perhaps biologically predisposed to connect with something beyond itself. Anywho, from these converging clues, the silent genome, the strange blood, the quantum leaps in our evolution, a picture begins to form. It's not proof nor evidence in the scientific sense, but a pattern that the human story may not be purely human. That something has, at intervals, intervened in our biology, nudging, blending, experimenting, etc. Our myths remember this as divine visitation, as seduction, as forbidden union. Our genetics remember it as mutation, anomaly, or hybridization. Across time, the same stories persist. The pharaohs of Egypt claim descent from the gods, often identifying themselves with Horus or Ra to legitimize their divine authority. The Merovingian kings of France traced their bloodlines to a sea creature, a lineage whispered in both legend and medieval chronicles. Sargon of Akkad was said to be born of a priestess and a god, while Olympias conceived Alexander the Great by way of Zeus Ammon, who appeared in the form of a serpent. Julius Caesar declared himself the child of Venus, cementing a divine claim to leadership in destiny. In China, the Yellow Emperor was said to be the son of a dragon, an archetypal symbol of cosmic power and transformation. In South Asia, the Mahabharata recounts the birth of Karna, a hero fathered by the sun god Surya, who entered the womb of his mortal mother through mystical means. In Mesoamerica, the Quiche Maya mythologized the hero twins Hunahpu and Xbalanque. I think that's how you say it. Hunahpu and Xbalanque as semi-divine beings born from the union of humans with celestial entities. Even among the Inuit and other circumpolar cultures, shamans spoke of children born from unions with sky spirits or animal spirits, destined for extraordinary abilities. Different continents, different cultures, same pattern. Divinity becomes flesh through a human womb. Blood becomes the bridge between worlds, a tangible line connecting mortal and immortal, human and otherworldly. These narratives, scattered across geography and time, reveal a nearly universal impulse to imagine humanity as malleable or permeable to forces beyond ourselves, a vessel for the sacred, the uncanny, and the extraordinary. These myths, while culturally specific, share more than a thematic echo. And I've gotten into this whole I've gotten into some of this stuff on previous episodes. If you check out my ultra-terrestrial cephalopods, Cthulhu, ufology, octopus-based episode, I get into some of this historical instances of humans breeding with non-human entities, specifically from the oceans. So that's out there if you want to check it out. But we will be getting deeper into that stuff through this series. But these myths, while culturally specific, share more than a thematic echo. They point to a reoccurring human fascination with the permeability of our own biology, our own nature. Across continents and aeons, stories suggest that the human body is not a closed system, but a conduit for powers beyond our mortal kin. Gods, spirits, celestial forces, or otherworldly intelligences. Whether it's Alexander's divine conception, Karna's sunborn parentage, or the Inuit children of sky spirits, the womb is imagined as a liminal space where mortal and immortal meet, where the ordinary bloodline becomes infused with extraordinary potential. Some modern interpretations, particularly within ufology and ancient astronaut theory, take a shot, read these myths as symbolic reflections of ancient contact with beings who may have shaped our biology or consciousness. So in this light, divine or semi-divine parentage can be understood not only as cultural claim to authority or sanctity, but as an expression of a deeper intuition that human identity is malleable, that extraordinary traits can emerge from union with the other, and that our genome itself may carry the echoes of these encounters. And beneath it all, Tantra, shamanic spirit marriages, ritualized intercourse with gods or angels, Hyros, Gamos, Humanity keeps reenacting the same primordial myth that contact with the other through the body can transform the soul. Whether through breeding, initiation, possession, the message is the same. Union with the non-human brings knowledge, power, or change. Definitely trauma. Every time. Even if it's not a violation. The one thing that we know for certain in most, at least modern abduction lore, ufological interpretations, the trauma is real. Science and myth, divided for centuries, are slowly circling back to each other. Our instruments peer into the code of life and find strange insertions. Our legends whisper of gods who once mingled their seed with ours. Between them lies a truth too old and perhaps too intimate, too weird in its implications, for either to claim alone. Where the genome is silent, mythology speaks. Where evolution stumbles, legends fill in the gaps. Perhaps the oldest story humanity has ever told, the story of our own creation, is neither fact nor fiction, but both. A record of unions between the human and the other. I point out before that the gods of language are often the teachers or creators of civilization its very self. DNA, our genetic makeup, is a chemical language. Symbolism, storytelling, is a specific kind of language. And it's here that we begin. Going forward with the anomalies of our DNA, our blood, and our evolution, we now turn to mythology. The myths that try to explain all of this. To the spirit brides, serpent fathers, amphibious gods, celestial lovers, SKYDADDIES, and the countless hybrid offspring said to have shaped the course of history and civilization itself. Before the arrival of Christianity, Islam, or even the codified priesthoods of Greece, Egypt, and Mesopotamia, the line between quote-unquote human and not human was far more flexible. For most of human history, the world was populated by beings who existed alongside of us, gods whose footsteps shaped mountains, spirits who resided in trees and rivers, ancestors who emerged from caves or the underworld, invisible presences responsible for fertility, lineage, and destiny. What we now call mythology was, for tens of thousands of years, reality. People didn't simply worship their gods, they interacted with them. They bargained, dreamed, consummated, conceived, and occasionally birthed children from these unions. And it's in this worldview that the cosmos was relational, transactional. Humans weren't sealed away from the supernatural. They were extensions of it. Birth, sexuality, inspiration, and death were all points of contact where humans and non-humans intersected. And it's in these encounters the boundaries of species blurred. The offspring of such unions, whether demigods, heroes, sorcerers, or monsters, stood as the bridge between worlds. It's only later, with the rise of moralizing monotheisms, that such encounters were reinterpreted as temptations, demons, or falls from grace. But long before these condemnations, the idea of humans and gods sharing beds and producing lineages was a central part of how ancient cultures understood ancestry, power, and the origin of extraordinary individuals. This episode explores most of those pre-Christian traditions, from prehistoric mother goddess cults to Near Eastern divine insemination myths, to Greek demigod and god theogonies, to fairy lovers, jinn spouses, and the spirit marriages of shamans. And at the end, we'll examine a modern reinterpretation, the ufologists and ancient astronaut theorists, take a shot, who claim that humanity was engineered by extraterrestrials, and that the gods themselves were sky-dwelling geneticists whose offspring walk among us today. They walk among us. The earliest myths are not written stories, but symbolic acts. Funerary and burial rites, fertility figurines, ritual cave penetrations. That motherfucker Freud would have a field day. And seasonal ceremonies in which early humans enacted sexual union with deities. The Hyros Gamos. Archaeologists studying Paleolithic and Neolithic cultures consistently find one reoccurring figure. The Great Mother, the Earth's womb, the primordial female force whose body was the landscape itself. And it's in these early societies that sexual union with the earth was symbolic and literal. Caves, dark womb-like chambers, were treated as entrances to the divine feminine, painted with animals and ancestors, and used as sites for rites, that rhymed, of renewal. Rain, rivers, seeds, menstrual blood, semen, or other more esoteric secretions. Can't spell secretions without the word secret. All were understood as sacred fluids exchanged between humans and gods. There are hints of sexualized ritual relationships between shamans and spirits. Prehistoric rock art frequently shows hybrid beings, part human, part animal, often with exaggerated sexual organs, we'll say. I will try to curb my elementary school humor for most of this, but it was just so weird. I gotta giggle at it to just get through it. So, pardon my French roast. These composite creatures suggest a worldview in which humans and non-humans intermingled not only metaphorically, but sexually and reproductively. Across the Arctic, Siberian, and steppe cultures, shamans routinely described having spirit spouses, invisible beings who taught them magic, served as guardians, and sometimes demanded sexual or marital fidelity. These relationships were not considered fantasies, but everyday essential components of shamanic power. Spirit wives could impregnate the shaman in visions, producing spiritual offspring. Spirit husbands could abduct female shamans in their dreams, granting them powers in exchange for devotion. These ideas survive in fragments among the Tungus, Yakut, Sami, Evenki, Ainu, and Inter-Asian groups, and similar beliefs appear in the Americas, Polynesia, and parts of Africa. The pattern is so global that it suggests this worldview predates the diaspora of early human beings. In other words, the concept of humans having sexual or marital relations with non-human beings is one of the oldest mythical ideas on Earth. And across prehistoric and pre-Christian Eurasia, Africa, and the Near East, one finds an astonishingly consistent motif: the belief that certain humans are married to spirits, that sexual relations occur during trance, possession, dream, or astral wandering, and that these unions can produce children, either literal or symbolic. These narratives don't merely decorate folklore, they act as the foundation stones for every idea that humanity overlaps with other older orders of being. In Siberian, Tunguskan, and circumpolar shamanic traditions, the shaman's initiation often includes a dramatic sexual or bridal encounter. Anthropologist A.A. Popov, P-O-P-O-V, documented Evenki shamans describing a spirit bride who seduces, overwhelms, or even dismembers the novice before restoring him with new supernatural organs. Very much parallels the alien implant idea. The union establishes a permanent bond that the spirit wife may appear in dreams or trance, and sexual activity with her is considered both necessary and dangerous. Neglect leads to illness, madness, or loss of power. I can't help but once again be reminded of the similarities between this particular myth theme with those that exist between modern-day alien abductions and the ancient Bon and later Tibetan Buddhist practice of the Chod ritual, wherein practitioners would find frightening and often purportedly haunted locations for meditation, wherein they would find demons or spirits and offer up their bodies as a feast in an act of bodhisattva mercy, sometimes even offering up purely symbolic or outright literal sacrifices of reproductive bodily fluids. A theme confirmed by the work of the aforementioned religious scholar Dr. Jeffrey Kripal, as well as a scholarly expert and practitioner of ancient Bon and tantric Buddhist rituals I've previously corresponded with, but whose name I don't have express permission to drop here. But yep, he done confirmed it. Humble brag, non-name drop. This is not metaphorical. For practitioners, the spirit spouse is as real as any living partner, a being who provides power, knowledge, and protection. Children resulting from this union are described as spirit children, not physical infants, but entities that accompany the shaman and assist in healing or divination. In West and Central African traditions, particularly among the Yoruba, Fon, and Congo cultures, spirit spouses are equally integral. A deity or river spirit, an Orisha or Mamiwata, chooses a human partner, often during a period of shamanic ordeal via illness or visionary crisis. Chosen individual must undergo ritual marriage, receive a spirit name, and abstain from certain human sexual relations, sometimes for life. A bit reminiscent of Catholic nuns as the quote-unquote brides of Christ, or priests being married to the Holy Spirit. Though the fidelity of some said priests is unfortunately quite questionable. Possession, trances, sometimes contain vivid descriptions of sexual climax, interpreted as the deity engaging its spouse. And these unions grant the medium status, healing abilities, or wealth, reinforcing the idea that interworld intercourse produces social power. In Celtic and Northern European traditions, erotic encounters with fairies, she beings, elves, or lake maidens frequently result in hybrid children, sometimes referred to as changelings. Many medieval Irish genealogies claim descent from fairy lovers. The Welsh tale of the Lady of the Lake describes a mysterious, beautiful non-human woman entering a marriage with a mortal man so long as he obeys specific taboos. Their children become the famous physicians of Midfi, I think that's how you say it, renowned for supernatural healing knowledge. And these stories portray the fairy lover as a bearer of hidden wisdom and their hybrid offspring as liminal beings, never fully at home in either world. In classical Greece, sexual encounters with nymphs, dryads, and daimons, D-A-I-M-O-N-S, were widely believed in and even experienced, in some instances even greatly feared. Shepherds encountering nymphs often suffered from something called nympholepsy, a state of madness, inspiration, or erotic possession. And these beings were not gentle. They could kill their lovers if approached improperly. Some families claim descent from nymphs, granting them a semi-divine status. The city of Athens declared its founder, Erichthonius, to be the son of Athena and Hephaestus, conceived through a dropped seed and Earth's womb. Onanism. Pre-Islamic Arabian religion already had a robust belief in jinn/human sexual encounters, but Islamic mystical and folkloric traditions preserved even more explicit accounts. Certain Marids and Ifrits were known to choose human spouses, appearing in dreams or shadows, offering wealth or knowledge and demanding sexual attention in return. These unions produced Karin children, shadow companions, spiritual doubles that influence a person's life. A number of Sufi traditions interpret erotic dreams with luminous beings as legitimate spiritual encounters. The Sumerian sacred marriage ritual, or Hieros Gamos, dramatized the sexual union between the goddess Inanna and the king, symbolically renewing the land and establishing the king's semi-divine status. Text from the Ed and Ur-3 periods described kings as children of gods and goddesses, conceived through dreams, visions, ecstatic rituals, or even divine substitution. Modern ancient astronaut theorists, take a shot, reinterpret the Anunnaki, sky beings, watchers, descending gods, as literal extraterrestrials engineering humanity through genetic manipulation. While not academically credible, they're going for it, this strain of thought demonstrates how the sexual union of gods and humans remains psychologically potent, even in modern secular UFO lore. Although most of the later Judeo-Christian material will be saved for next episode, it is worth noting that the Nephilim story acts as the bridge between pre-Christian mythology and the later demonological interpretations that will dominate Western thought going forward. In the ancient Near East, the story was not yet, quote-unquote, sinful. It was just one more instance of gods or heavenly beings fathering mighty men of old, men of renown. And only later did religious reformers reinterpret this as an abomination. Ooh. Northern European folklore includes repeated accounts of mer beings who take human spouses, father children, and then return to the sea.
I'm going out for a pack of smokes.
These hybrid children often possess unique physical features such as webbed fingers, unusual eyes, uncanny swimming abilities, etc. Entire families in the Hebrides claim Selkie ancestry well into the 19th century. And these stories blur into the UFO motif of starseeds or indigo children, humans believed to carry alien traits. Before the 20th century ever coined terms like extraterrestrial, many pre-Christian myths already contained cosmic engineers, sky visitors, and offspring of star beings. Dogon, Zulu, and San cosmologies describe sky beings, sometimes reptilian or aquatic, who descend to teach, mate, or interbreed with humans. Zulu historian Credo Mutwa claimed African myths include explicit accounts of sky reptiles mating with human women. While this blends folklore, personal vision, and symbol, it resonates with global patterns. In fact, Mutwa himself claims to have been subjected to a much more startling form of these interbreeding events. Quetzalcoatl, Kukulkan, and Viracocha appear as civilizing sky beings, and some accounts describe their unions with human women, producing lineages of high priests and kings. Several Aboriginal groups describe cloud or sky beings who impregnate women through dreams, light, or spirit touch, concepts that echo modern abductee stories of non-physical insemination. In Maori tradition, Taniwa, or guardian spirits, and Atwa, ancestral gods, sometimes take human wives, resulting in lineages of high-status chiefs. As human societies developed more complex cosmologies, the idea of intimate contact between mortals and otherworldly beings became a central mechanism for explaining the origins of heroes, dynasties, and cultural innovators, progenitors of civilization. In Greece, the phenomenon reached its most elaborate literary expression. Zeus alone fathered a multitude of children with mortal women under guises that blurred the line between seduction and supernatural rape. I'm just going to call it what it is, rape. And some of it also, technically, bestiality. But hey, call a spade a spade. His unions, we'll say, with Leda in the form of a swan produced Helen and the Dioscuri. With Danae in the form of a golden light, he produced Perseus. And with Alcmene, in a night that lasted 3 days, he fathered Hercules or Heracles. These narratives presented sexual contact with gods as potentially dangerous, often traumatic, but capable of generating beings of mixed status who existed between worlds. Greek authors treated these encounters as both mythical and ideological. Explanations for why heroes possessed superhuman strength, divine favor, or a tragic destiny shaped by forces beyond their understanding. And another interesting side note, this time more of a etymological curiosity, but the term ideological has a double meaning. It refers to both an explanation of something by giving a cause or reason for it, often in the historical or mythological context, but it can also be used in a medical context, referring to the cause or referring to the cause of or contributing factors to the development of a disease or condition, bringing to mind the aforementioned nympholepsy, or perhaps even divinely transmitted diseases, possibly even something of more infernal origins, ST demons, if you will. Perhaps it wouldn't hurt to remind listeners that viruses were largely responsible for much of the major jumps in human evolution. Space aid's going to get you. Other Mediterranean cultures contained parallel themes. In the Near East, goddesses such as Ishtar and Nana were known for their erotic power, and myths frequently depicted divine seduction as a transformative ordeal. The Sumerian sacred marriage rite, Hieros Gamos, between the high priestess and the king playing the role of Dumuzi, shepherd god king of fertility and divine consort of the aforementioned goddess, was understood as a reenactment of cosmic sexuality that ensured fertility for the land. And although these rituals were symbolic rather than literal claims of divine impregnation, the boundary between enacted myth and perceived spiritual reality was flexible. When later fringe theorists began speaking of the Anunnaki as extraterrestrial genetic engineers, a claim popularized in the 20th century, they were drawing on the long-standing belief that humans were shaped and sometimes physically touched by beings of a higher order. Across the Indo-Iranian world, the Vedic texts also claim stories of gods taking human lovers. The Apsaras, which were celestial nymphs, frequently descended from the heavens to entice sages or heroes, sometimes disrupting their ascetic practices, sometimes assisting them in their heroic labors. Alternatively, male deities, such as Indra, were notorious for seducing mortal women. Another thunder god. What up with them guys? Often resulting in tension between moral order and divine desire. And these stories emphasized that intimate contact with gods was unpredictable. Unpredictable. It could elevate a lineage or disrupt it entirely. The offspring of such unions were often heroes whose liminality symbolized the spiritual potential or peril of crossing boundaries between worlds. In the Celtic and broader pre-Christian European imagination, the veil between the human and the otherworldly realms was thinner still. Irish and Welsh literature is filled with accounts of humans marrying, conceiving with, or being abducted by the Sidhe, the fairy people. And these unions were not always benevolent. In many of the tales, a fairy lover appeared as a shapeshifter or nighttime visitor, a bedroom interloper, sometimes bestowing gifts, sometimes draining vitality. offspring of these encounters, half human, half supernatural, were believed to grow into uncanny figures whose beauty, talent, or just outright weirdness marked them as different. In Scottish lore, the Banshee and the Gleistig could function as seductresses. The Banshee. While in Scandinavian tradition, the Huldra tempted men into the forest with a blend of erotic allure and hidden dangers. These stories portrayed sexuality as a gateway to the liminal zones of the cosmos, where humans risked losing themselves, but could also gain esoteric wisdom, uncanny abilities, or divine blessings. Further north, Norse literature viewed intimate encounters with elves or land spirits as ancient and honorable origins for certain bloodlines. Medieval genealogies would sometimes identify royal houses as descended from beings described euphemistically as Alfar or Vatir. The recognition that strength, beauty, or magical skill must have come from somewhere beyond the human realm. The sagas occasionally describe men encountering supernatural women, volor, giants, or elf maidens, who offered knowledge or sexual initiation in exchange for loyalty or lineage. Such unions symbolize treaties between the visible world of humans and the hidden world of the spirits that shaped fate, fertility, and the mystery of inheritance. The Arabian Peninsula provides another layer of tradition. Pre-Islamic folklore is rich with stories of jinn taking human lovers. Jinn were understood not as demons, but as a parallel race of smokeless, fire-formed beings, or perhaps plasma. Intelligences whose lives intersected with humanity in complex ways. Some tribes attributed their origins to unions between noble ancestors and powerful jinn, claim that conferred both prestige and danger. These unions were rarely simple romantic fairy tales. They often carried warnings about the unpredictable consequences of mingling with beings whose passions and loyalties do not align with human morality. Certain lineages were believed to have prophetic or poetic gifts because of jinn ancestry, echoes of the Greek belief that divine unions produced heroes, or the Celtic idea that fairy bloodlines carried unusual talents. Across the vast terrains of Central Asia and Siberia, shamanic traditions contain some of the most direct claims of spiritual sexual encounters. In many Siberian initiation narratives, the future shaman undergoes a visionary ordeal in which spirits dismember and reconstitute their body, or in which they take spirit spouses, partners who teach them healing, magic, or the secret language or languages of animals. Spirit spouses might appear as ancestors, animals, or beings of ambiguous form, and the relationship could be overtly erotic. Anthropologists of the 19th and 20th centuries documented shamans who described having married spirits in dreams, receiving their power through intercourse. Such unions were essential to the shaman's ability to travel between worlds, and the offspring of these unions sometimes appeared symbolically as spirit assistants or familiars. And although not literal children, they function as hybrid progeny, a synthesis of human consciousness and otherworldly forces. East Asia also preserved traditions of supernatural sexuality that blurred the distinction between spirits and mortals. In China, fox spirits, called Huli Jing, were notorious for seducing humans, but these encounters often involved mutual fascination and transformation. Some tales end with hybrid descendants or gifted children, echoing the broader world pattern of supernatural unions producing beings of exceptional abilities. In Japan, Kitsune and Tengu myths likewise include tales of otherworldly seduction. The children of such unions, when they appear, are marked by high intelligence, martial prowess, magical talent, and so on. Abe no Seimei, aka the Japanese Merlin, being just one of the more well-known examples. These stories reveal a cosmology in which the boundaries between humans and non-humans are extremely flexible, and sexual intimacy is one of the most potent bridges between realms. Even to this very day, the Emperor of Japan is perceived to be derived from the genetic lineage of the sun goddess Amaterasu. Similar beliefs are mirrored throughout history of both Eastern and Western cultures, from the ancient Chinese heavenly mandate to the European divine right of kings, a theme that will be explored more in depth in a later episode of this series. As we move toward the Iron Age and classical antiquity, these traditions increasingly began to be interpreted allegorically by philosophers and moralists, but they never lost cultural authority. Even as Greek philosophers debated the literal existence of gods, farmers and hunters still whispered about nymphs, satyrs, and spirits who might slip into the mortal world under cover of night. In the Middle East, as Babylonian and Persian cosmologies evolved, older myths of gods mating with humans were reinterpreted through theological and moral lenses, but the underlying fascination remained. Humans were never entirely alone in the universe, and the boundaries of the flesh were permeable. When the modern UFO lore emerged in the 20th century, especially through the contactee movements of the 1950s and 60s, and later on the abduction narratives of the 60s to today, it inherited these ancient structures almost unconsciously. The idea of extraterrestrials engineering humanity, popularized by authors like Zecharia Sitchin, Eric von Daniken, and later David Jacobs or Bud Hopkins, functioned as a technological reinterpretation of the oldest myth of all, that humans are the children of beings from the sky. We're all made of stars. Modern abductees, who describe sexual encounters aboard spacecraft, are echoing, whether they realize it or not, the same story sung by Greek poets and recited by Siberian shamans. The vocabulary has changed. Genetics instead of gods, hybridization instead of divine lineage, but the psychological architecture is identical. Humanity still imagines itself as the product of unions with the other, still struggling with the fear and allure of forces that transcend our understanding, and still returns again and again the image of the womb touched by something not entirely human. As ancient Near Eastern civilizations expanded and intermingled, their mythical narratives concerning divine human unions began to take on an explicitly political dimension. Kingship itself became the ultimate expression of hybrid lineage, with the ruler positioned as a liminal being whose blood carried a trace of divinity. The Sumerians formalized this earlier than any other known society, embedding the idea in their royal hymns and temple liturgies. Kings were born from unions between gods and specially chosen women, and as a result, they mediated between heaven and earth. This motif appears in texts surrounding Gilgamesh, an inscription about Sargon of Akkad, and in later Babylonian material concerning the cosmic fatherhood of Marduk. Quack, quack. The sexual component of these myths is not incidental. The erotic encounter serves as the metaphysical bridge that both legitimizes the king's authority and reaffirms the god's ongoing involvement in human affairs. Across the region, similar ideologies emerged. In Egypt, pharaohs were not merely descended from gods, but often considered literal offspring of divine conception. The Luxor divine birth reliefs depict Amun impregnating Queen Ahmose, begetting Hatshepsut. Her very existence demonstrated a lineage where the physical womb of a human woman became the vessel through which a deity chose to manifest power in mortal form. The womb as an alchemical crucible, perhaps. In these traditions, sexuality is a cosmological architecture, an act that reproduces the universe's hierarchy on Earth. The god's desire for human lovers mirrors the mingling of cosmic forces, while the offspring embody a fusion of realms otherwise held separate. Far from being confined to political propaganda, divine human sexuality permeated daily religious belief. The sexual encounters between gods and mortals were recited as explanations for agricultural cycles, fertility, and the origins of specific clans or priestly families. In Ugaritic poetry, gods such as Baal or Baal engage in erotic unions with mortal or semi-divine females. In Anatolian myths, storm gods abduct or seduce human women whose children serve as cultural heroes. It's always storm and thunder gods. It's crazy. I don't know. Maybe there's something to that. Thunder does come from the sky. These stories reinforce the idea that the boundaries between species, realms, and metaphysical categories were flexible. Humans might be mortal, but their reproductive capacity made them targets, and sometimes partners, of beings beyond the human race. Greek mythology elevated the theme of divine human sexuality to an art form, merging religious symbolism with a fascination for transformation, seduction, and desire. Unlike the more formulaic royal lineages of the Near East, Greek stories portrayed gods taking on multiple shapes: animals, elements, humans, and hybrids, to engage with mortals. Zeus's erotic pursuits alone span the entire landscape of Greek myth. Leda with a swan, Europa with a bull, Danae with a shower of gold. Zeus, dude, scale it back a bit, okay? Alcmene and her husband's likeness, etc. Each union results in a semi-divine offspring whose abilities and destinies are shaped by the tension between human vulnerability and divine powers. These narratives served as more than entertainment. They conveyed philosophical questions regarding the nature of agency, consent, and the permeability of the human form. Greek theologians and playwrights debated whether mortals had any autonomy when approached by a god, and whether conception under such circumstances produced children destined for heroism or tragedy. Hercules, Perseus, and Helen of Troy all embody this complicated inheritance. They are beings too much for the human world, capable of extraordinary feats, but doomed to instability due to their mixed nature. Greek thought also emphasized the erotic as an initiatory force. Mystery religions such as the Dionysian and Orphic cults conceptualized divine presence as an intoxicating, sometimes overwhelming union with forces outside the self. Some of those Dionysian bacchanals, I forget the proper name, but they were just a swarm of frenzied women overcome with so much desire that they've been known to cannibalize the men that they were engaging with. But in these contexts, sexual relations between mortals and gods were not literal historical events, but spiritual processes. The ecstatic rites, such as drumming, dancing, intoxication, and trance, served as symbolic unions through which participants could become wedded to a god and partake of its essence. This framework would later influence Hellenistic magical papyri, where spells invoke intercourse with spirits, daimons, or astral intelligences. Daimons, where the word demon comes from. I want to repeat, astral intelligences, meaning of the stars, intelligences, to gain knowledge, power, or prophetic vision. In these accounts, sexuality becomes both mythical history and ritual technology. It's simultaneously a story of ancient unions and an ever-present possibility for practitioners who seek communion with non-human intelligences through altered states. This dual function sets the stage for later occult traditions in late antiquity, where erotic encounters with supernatural entities become formalized into magical practices. In yet another quick aside, but one that once again hints towards future installments in this series, I would be remiss in my podcast daddy duties if I neglected to mention modern-day shamanism. In the modern era, these themes have quietly reappeared in places far from temples, sanctuaries, or mystery schools. Contemporary psychonauts, whether operating within clinical studies or outside of them, report encounters during high-dose psychedelic states that sound startlingly like the spirit marriages and erotic visitations of pre-Christian antiquity. In Dr. Rick Strassman's DMT research in the 1990s, volunteers repeatedly described beings who approached them with an intense sense of familiarity, almost as if they were old lovers reunited after a long separation. Some subjects spoke of being physically examined, penetrated, or merged with luminous entities whose intentions seemed simultaneously scientific and intimate. One particularly harrowing account, documented in the book The Spirit Molecule, recounts one man's experience that is, without mincing words, essentially an instance of sexual assault by an extraterrestrial reptilian entity. Others reported sensations indistinguishable from sexual climax, except that the partner was invisible, hyper-real, or composed of some intelligent geometry. Strassman, cautious as ever, avoided definitive interpretations, but he did observe that the boundaries between erotic contact, psychic fusion, and non-human presence collapsed with startling ease under DMT's influence. Outside laboratory walls, these accounts become even more explicit. Experienced ayahuascaros speak of being embraced by feminine or serpentine spirits, entities that enter the body through the spine, pelvis, or mouth, and induce waves of pleasure or union that feel less like a hallucination and more like consummation. Once again, that old primordial Kundalini serpent rears its reptilian head. Western psychonauts using synthetic DMT tell of encounters with insectoid or elf-like beings who teach through touch, using sexualized energy to transmit information or restructure the self. On internet forums, in retreat centers, and in underground psychedelic circles, the language mirrors ancient myths almost too similarly. Beings who mate with humans to impart knowledge, entities who blend consciousness with practitioners, spirits who use erotic contact as initiation. Unlike in the old stories, there is no shared cosmology to interpret these experiences, yet the forms repeat themselves. The ancient paradigm of divine-human union has migrated into the visionary chemistry of the present, suggesting that the erotic encounter with the other may be an archetype older than religion itself, one that reasserts itself whenever the gates of perception are forced fully open. Moving north into pre-Christian Europe, the theme of human, non-human sexuality becomes entwined with landscape spirits, ancestral beings, and the cosmic cycles tied to the land itself. Celtic traditions describe the Sheed, fairy beings whose beauty is extraordinary, whose desires are unpredictable, and whose interactions with humans often sexual. Kings, heroes, and even ordinary wanderers might encounter a luminous woman at a crossroads, in a forest clearing, or emerging from a burial mound. These women, sometimes benevolent and sometimes lethally dangerous, sought lovers from the human world. Their unions could produce children with prophetic gifts, unusual talents, or destinies entangled with the otherworld. These stories often serve dual roles. On one level, they express the tension between civilization and wilderness. The fair folk represent untamed nature, the erotic expression of the landscape itself. On another level, they define the origin of dynasties, clans, or sacred families. The notion of fairy blood persisted into medieval Europe, where noble houses occasionally traced their ancestry to spirits or enchantresses. Such lineage myths provided legitimacy for lack of a better word, and a sense of otherworldly distinction. Norse mythology offers its own network of hybrid encounters. Giants, or Jotun, frequently mate with gods, producing offspring who serve as cultural heroes or cosmic forces. Loki, perhaps the most boundary-breaking figure of the Norse pantheon, engages in shape-shifting and gender-shifting erotic episodes resulting in children that defy classification. This would include Sleipnir, the eight-legged horse of Odin. Just imagine that getting pushed out of your birth canal. Norse stories often frame these unions as metaphors for the mingling of primal elemental forces, but they also reveal a worldview in which the categories of human, divine, and monstrous are never strict. In Germanic and Slavic regions, pre-Christian folklore includes seductive forest spirits, river maidens, and mountain nymphs who lure men into unions that are simultaneously blissful and dangerous. The children born of these encounters are sometimes changelings, sometimes gifted, and often destined for liminal roles within their communities. These tales, though later Christianized into warnings about demonic seduction, originates in a worldview where humans share the land with entities possessing their own desires and reproductive capacities. Pre-Islamic Arabian cosmology features an entire class of beings, the jinn, whose interactions with humans include love, seduction, and reproduction. These spirits, composed of smokeless fire, occupy deserts, abandoned settlements, and liminal spaces. They're not inherently evil. They mirror the moral complexity of humans and display desires that include erotic attraction. Stories of men and women taken as lovers by jinn appear throughout Arabian folklore, sometimes resulting in hybrid children who possess supernatural abilities or uncanny insight. The jinn occupy a unique space in the comparative mythology of sexual hybridization. Unlike Greek gods or Celtic fairies, they are not necessarily tied to a specific landscape or kingdom. Instead, they represent an invisible parallel society with its own political structures, tribes, and genealogies. Genealogies. Human-jinn unions emphasize the proximity of this hidden world, suggesting that the boundaries between species are permeable and subject to negotiations.
And can I wear the Scream mask? The mask from Scream.
Later Islamic teachings would reinterpret these encounters according to the theological principles, but the pre-Islamic stories remain vivid examples of erotic relationships with non-human intelligences that coexist alongside humanity. By the time we approach the early centuries of the Common Era, the Mediterranean and Near Eastern worlds are saturated with narratives of erotic encounters between humans and gods, spirits, daemons, and otherworldly beings. These encounters produce heroes, kings, prophets, and hybrid offspring whose destinies shape entire civilizations. These myths aren't marginal nor taboo in their original context. They form the backbone of religious cosmology and a cultural identity. The transition to monotheism radically reinterprets these themes. And what earlier cultures celebrated as divine human intercourse is reframed as transgression, corruption, or demonic interference. The beings once considered gods or fae are reclassified as fallen angels or demons, and the children of such unions become symbols of chaos or forbidden knowledge. The shift sets the stage for the Judeo-Christian and Islamic interpretations that will dominate the next episode of this series. But before that transformation unfolds, it's crucial to understand that for thousands of years prior to monotheistic consolidation, human societies across the globe accepted the possibility, indeed often the inevitability, of erotic entanglement with non-human beings. These unions produced not only mythical heroes, but entire worldviews in which humanity was one of many species with reproductive, emotional, and cosmic agency. Long before the rigid cosmologies of medieval Christianity, reinterpreted divine human unions as demonic violations. Many pre-Christian civilizations framed sexual contact with gods, spirits, or the dead not as taboo, but as profound and often a necessary bridge between worlds. Across the ancient Near East, Mediterranean, Indian subcontinent, and various Indo-European societies, sacred sexuality occupied a special position as both symbol and technology. It functioned as a mechanism for maintaining cosmic balance, ensuring royal legitimacy, transmission of divine power, and mediation between human communities and supernatural forces who governed fertility, fate, and to understand later traditions of hybrid offspring, Nephilim lore, and alien hybrid narratives, it's essential to first situate them in this older landscape where the boundaries between human and otherworldly was not merely porous, but often intentionally cultivated. In Mesopotamia, the Hieros Gamos, or sacred marriage, stood at the center of royal ideology. Kings enacted ritual intercourse with priestesses representing goddesses, such as Inanna or Ishtar, in order to secure the god's blessings upon the land. These rites were not metaphors. Surviving temple liturgies and hymns make clear that ancient participants believed divine energy literally entered the human world through sexual union. Fertility was not a vague hope, but a measurable embodied force bestowed through the goddess's presence within the ritual sexual act. Because Inanna or Ishtar was associated with war as much as sexuality, some scholars argue that the sacred marriage was about more than agricultural abundance. It established a hybridized sovereignty in which the king, made son of the goddess, ruled as a liminal being who embodied both human and divine qualities. And while these rites did not claim the literal birth of semi-divine children in the way later myths would, they established the conceptual groundwork. Ritual sex was not simply permitted, it was the bridge by which divinity impregnated the social and political world. And yes, sex magic will be a major component of this series going forward. In fact, there's going to be at least one episode covering that in its entirety. Well, the entirety of the episode, not the entirety of sex magic. A closely related dynamic appears throughout pre-Hellenic Greek religions, where priests and priestesses, especially those associated with Dionysus, Demeter, and Persephone, engaged in rites blending ecstatic trance, bodily abandonment, and symbolic sexual union. Dionysian possession, in particular, reflects a mode of divine contact that modern scholars often compare to Afro-Brazilian and South Asian mediumistic practices. Participants believe that during ecstatic states, the god literally entered their bodies, sometimes described as a penetration of the mind, sometimes explicitly of the womb, granting prophetic insights, supernatural vitality, or ritual madness. The Greeks also preserved a long tradition of heroes conceived through the direct sexual approach of gods, such as Leda and Zeus, Danae, and the shower of gold. Well, I'm not touching it. Or the union of Apsyrtus's mother with a spirit of the night. These myths maintain the notion that gods could assume physical, semi-physical, or luminous forms capable of sexually engaging with mortals. And later, Christian commentators would reinterpret these divine suitors as incubi or demons. But in their pre-Christian context, they formed the backbone of heroic genealogies and ancestral legitimacy. On the Indian subcontinent, proto-tantric and tantric traditions preserved a complex understanding of sexual union as a metaphysical and alchemical process. Early Shaiva Shakta cults viewed the human body as a microcosm of the divine, and sexual rites were intended to collapse the distinction between human and cosmic forces. Unlike Mesopotamian Hieros Gamos, which emphasized political and agricultural fertility, Tantra explored sexual union as a means of altering consciousness, dissolving individuality, and entering states of possession or divine embodiment. Texts such as the Kubjika Tantras and the Yogin Hridaya, Yogini Hydra. Okay, one more time. Yogini Hridaya describe encounters with yoginis, semi-divine female beings, sometimes ancestral spirits, sometimes fully supernatural entities, who can initiate the practitioner through erotic or quasi-erotic communion. And while not usually framed as literal reproduction, these encounters transfer Shakti, power, illumination, and occasionally a form of spiritual lineage comparable to adoption by a goddess or spirit woman. In some Himalayan tribal traditions that fed into early tantric cults, humans were explicitly said to descend from marriages between ancestors and spirit women of the mountains and forests, which parallels Northern European tales of elf women who bore children to human men. The Hyros Gamos motif also appears in pre-Zoroastrian Iranian religion, where royal legitimacy depended on descent from Kivadina, the divine glory that could enter the womb of chosen mothers. The Avesta describes kings born from encounters with luminous beings or divine essences deposited within lakes or sacred groves, blurring the line between physical conception and supernatural impregnation. Even in ancient Egypt, pharaohs were often portrayed as literal sons of God, conceived when deities like Amun assumed human form to impregnate royal women. These accounts were not symbolic genealogies, but official doctrine. It was politically and ritually necessary for the dynasty to assert a direct biological relationship with divine powers. Pre-Christian Northern Europe maintained similar traditions of human interactions with elves, land spirits, Valkyries, and ancestors who returned through dreams or lucid trance states to mate with mortals. Medieval scribes Christianized or demonized many of these histories and stories, but earlier poetic sources in Old Norse and early Celtic literature preserve accounts of liminal beings, sometimes called Alfir, Disir, or Shi, who approached humans for sexual or reproductive purposes. In many cases, these unions produced semi-supernatural children, notable for their physical beauty, powers of prophecy, or warrior prowess. In the Irish Ectre tales, the otherworld queen frequently takes a human lover, promising sovereignty and supernatural offspring. Such narratives exhibit a structural similarity to Mesopotamian and Indo-Iranian divine marriage myths. The chosen human becomes a vessel of divine power through sexual encounter with a being whose nature blurs the boundaries between mortal, ancestral, and cosmic. These wide-ranging traditions, Mesopotamian Hyros Gamos, Greek divine seduction, Proto-Tantric Yogini initiation, Iranian divine glory conception, and Northern European elf marriages, share a fundamental assumption. The human body can serve as a point of contact with non-human intelligences, whose presence is sometimes sexual, sometimes initiatory, and often reproductive, whether literally or spiritually, symbolically. More importantly, these traditions demonstrate that human, non-human intimate contact did not originate as an aberration or transgression. In most cases, it was central to religious practice, kingship, or cosmological order and hierarchy. This stands in stark contrast to later Abrahamic demonological frameworks, which viewed such unions as violations of cosmic law, abominations of nature. For now, however, this episode remains firmly in the pre-Christian sphere, where sexual union with gods, spirits, or non-human entities was not only possible, but expected. The transition from polytheistic antiquity into early Judeo-Christian monotheism did not erase beliefs in hybrid beings or sexual relations between mortals and non-human entities. Rather, it just reframed them. Before the later Christian demonology systems turned such contact into a matter of sin, pollution, or spiritual corruption, early Jewish cosmology held a more complex and sometimes ambivalent, sometimes, relationship to the idea of non-human entities interacting with humanity. This is particularly visible in the rich mythological ecosystems that persisted across Near Eastern cultures, where the lines between gods, angels, demons, and ancestral spirits were fluid, where the boundaries between human and non-human reproduction were not yet fully systemized. In early Mesopotamian thought, the categories of deity, spirit, and ancestor overlapped, and accounts of divine beings mating with mortals weren't viewed as paradoxical, but rather as part of a ordained universe in which humans and gods occupied different points along the same continuum. The Anunnaki. While not consistently described as sexually reproducing with humans, were certainly implicated because of the implications in the shaping, governing, and reproductive orders of humanity. In the Sumerian creation myths, human beings were fashioned through a mixture of clay and divine substance, sometimes the blood of a slain god, sometimes a fluid described in terms that later traditions would reinterpret as essence or seed. Later ufological writers, particularly in ancient astronaut theories, take a shot, seized upon those motifs to propose that such stories encode accounts of genetic intervention or crossbreeding. While mainstream historians don't support this interpretation, obviously, the mythical language undeniably blurs the boundaries between human lineage and divine substance. A similar liminal space exists in early Jewish lore. The Hebrew Bible, though later read through a strictly monotheistic lens, preserves traces of a much older, more diversified celestial hierarchy. The quote-unquote sons of God and quote-unquote heavenly council episodes in the Hebrew text reflect an older worldview wherein Yahweh presided over a retinue of divine beings. Early Jewish interpreters did not always think of these beings as wholly disembodied or neuter, i.e. without gender. Instead, they possessed agency, personality, and in some cases, bodies subtle enough to appear human. In the earliest strata of Jewish thought, angels were not the abstract, immaterial entities of later theologies, but powerful beings who could walk, eat, fight, and have hook. Should they, take a take a form indistinguishable from humans, that is. This worldview provides fertile ground for the later idea that these beings could cross the last taboo boundary, that of sexual union. And while last episode I had to clarify many times in doing this research, especially with search engines, sexual encounters with non-human entities, not bestiality. Oh boy, a lot of fucked up news stories came up when I was looking into this. I didn't type not bestiality at first. I pretty much had to find workarounds for this in order to further go down the rabbit hole, so to speak, on this topic. The reason I bring up the concept of bestiality, that is why the angels were looked down upon, the ones who bred the Nephilim. Because for them to have sexual relations with humanity was tantamount to humans having sexual relations with monkeys. So, I don't know. That's how that's how it was viewed. I don't know what that says about humanity in the eyes of divine figures, but, well, I know what it does say. I know what it says to me. I can interpret it pretty well. The famous and controversial passage of Genesis 6, 1-4, describing the quote-unquote sons of God taking human women, stands at the center of this tradition. Whatever interpretive strategies later rabbis and church fathers would impose on the text, the oldest reading, and the one adopted by the Book of Enoch, is that these beings were celestial entities who violated cosmic boundaries by taking mortal wives. The offspring, aka the Nephilim, were described not merely as giants, but as violent, hybrid creatures, monsters of various form, whose existence disturbed the cosmic order. The sexual dimension of this contact is unambiguous in the Enochian tradition, where the Watchers descend upon Mount Hermon and swear an oath to possess mortal women. Their actions are framed not as seduction, but as a coordinated program of transgressive knowledge sharing, genetic mixing, and even technological deviation from divine law. Modern demonologist Nathaniel Gillis, interesting guy, interesting ideas, drawing from esoteric and Jewish folklore, has argued that in these earliest accounts, the beings involved were not angels in the later sanitized sense, but something closer to ancient Mesopotamian intermediate beings, entities with bodies that were subtle, malleable, and capable of assuming forms suitable and functionally compatible for sexual interactions. Gillis frequently highlights parallels between early Jewish accounts and later medieval stories of entities that drain vitality, alter dreams, or manipulate perception. But we'll delve further into most of that next episode. It's important to note that Gillis himself sees these as continuous with earlier Watcher and Nephilim narratives. He proposes that early Jewish demonology preserved memories of beings who interacted with humanity in more tangible, corporeal ways than later theology would permit. Whether you accept Gillis's interpretation or not, the textual evidence does show that early Jewish cosmology never fully severed the link between the celestial and the carnal. In the Book of Enoch, the offspring of these unions was not merely large or strong, they were metaphysically disordered. Neither fully divine nor fully human, beings whose presence warped the balance of creation. Abominations. They're abominations. Such hybrids became metaphors for forbidden knowledge and transgressive power. The Watchers taught metalworking, enchantments, incantations, cosmetics, weapons making. Rings true of the God Triady. That one of our presidents, I believe it was Truman or Eisenhower, both of those could have gone real differently. Celestial interlopers for technology, specifically defense technology. Anyway, they taught mirror magic and other arts that were considered precocious or dangerous for mortal men and women. This motif that non-human beings impart secret knowledge to their hybrid or chosen human partners repeats across cultures and aeons, appearing in Greek myths, such as the giants and the offspring of gods, Irish tales, like the children of the Tuatha De Danann, and the Arabian jinn traditions, where unions produce children who are neither entirely of fire nor entirely of clay, quote unquote. The Nephilim narrative also resonates strongly with Mesopotamian traditions. Scholars have long noted that the Watchers of the Enochian literature resemble the Opkaloo, the semi-divine sages of Akkadian lore who taught humanity the arts of civilization. The Opkaloo, like the Watchers, were associated with forbidden knowledge, liminal forms, and hybrid bodies. In some flood accounts, the post-Diluvian Opkaloo were depicted as corrupt descendants of divine human unions. This parallels the Enochian idea that the Nephilim spirits survived the flood as disembodied, malevolent beings, an early template for the concept of demons. This Mesopotamian/Jewish continuity becomes even clearer when viewed through the lens of modern ufology. Ancient astronaut theorists, take a shot, often link the Anunnaki to the Watchers, arguing that both represent accounts of technologically advanced beings who intervened biologically in early humanity's history. And yes, while this interpretation lacks academic support, structural similarity of the narrative is obvious. Both describe powerful, non-human beings descending from the heavens. Both involve the imparting of knowledge that accelerates human development, and both culminate in the creation of hybrid beings seen as destabilizing or dangerous. Yet what is perhaps most striking is how nearly every ancient culture frames these unions as boundary violations, not necessarily immoral in the later Christian sense, but cosmically disruptive. In the ancient world, the union of gods and mortals was a source of both blessing and instability. Heroes like Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh, I like Gilgamesh better. Heracles, or Cuchulainn. Born of these liaisons, were extraordinary but often tragic. They stood between worlds, embodying the creative and destructive potential of hybrid lineage. The early Jewish tradition inherited this ambivalence, but ultimately moved toward a more restrictive cosmology, where such crossings were not just dangerous, but existentially forbidden. As the ancient Near East moved toward more systemized cosmologies, the boundary between gods, spirits, and humans remained flexible, especially in the transitional zones between Mesopotamian, Levantine, and Proto-Israeli cultures. Early Judaic tradition, especially in the pre-exile and Second Temple phases, inherited a world already full of hybrid beings, divine human couplings, and cosmic transgressions. Long before later rabbinic authorities sought to harden monotheism into a strict theological architecture, Israelite religion was steeped in the broader West Semitic milieu in which gods took mortal lovers, desert spirits wandered the margins, and the line between angels, demons, and astral beings was not distinct. Even when direct references to divine mortal sex were minimized or condemned, the older mythical structures lingered in fragments, encoded in etymologies, offhand allusions with an A, and the mythic skeleton beneath the canonical texts. One example lies in the early Hebrew concept of the Seirim, probably saying that wrong, goat-shaped wilderness spirits, referenced in Leviticus and Isaiah. Although later tradition classifies them as demonic, their characteristics reflect older desert demonology and perhaps even pre-Israelite fertility spirit cults. These beings were sometimes believed to seduce or interact sexually with humans, a trait shared with Shedim, another liminal class of beings that in some early traditions possessed reproductive capabilities. Demonologist Nathaniel Gillis, drawing on scattered demonological and folkloric sources, argues that ancient Hebrew demonology remembers a class of parasocial entities that interact with humans in ways strikingly reminiscent of modern alien abduction lore. Nocturnal visitations, dream state interactions, reproductive exchanges, and the production of offspring that are neither fully human nor fully other. Although Gillis's interpretations are speculative and highly interpretive, they highlight a consistent anthropological pattern. The beings on the margins of monotheistic cosmology, i.e. angels, demons, wilderness spirits, and the like, often retain features of earlier fertility entities and astral visitors. This becomes especially clear when the traditions surrounding the Watchers, the mysterious angelic beings introduced in the Book of Enoch, but hinted at in earlier scriptural passages. Enochian literature preserves an older, more mythical memory of the cosmos. Angels who descend from heaven interact physically with human women and generate a race of colossal hybrid offspring known as the Nephilim. The narrative is framed as a cosmic fall, a violation of divine order, but it bears all the hallmarks of a deeper pan-Middle Eastern myth in which otherworldly beings intermingle with humankind, bringing forbidden knowledge, altered lineages, and destabilizing consequences. In the Enochian account, the Watchers are not ephemeral spirits, but embodied, potent beings with the ability to take wives, teach metallurgy, enchantments, cosmetics, astrology, and warfare. Their hybrid children, the Nephilim, are described as giants, warriors, and consumers of human labors and flesh. While the text condemns the union, its narrative logic reflects the same structural motifs found across Indo-European, Semitic, and Mesopotamian traditions. Extraordinary beings arriving from the sky, copulating with mortals, and producing a new lineage with elevated or unstable traits. The condemnation belongs to later theological interpretation. However, the fascination is far older. At this juncture, the parallels with Mesopotamian traditions often become unavoidable. The Anunnaki, though not originally depicted as extraterrestrials, were celestial and chthonic deities, chthonic meaning underworld, involved in the ordering of the cosmos, creation of humanity, and the mediation between heaven and earth. Their roles in myth, descending, interceding, interfering, or judging, overlap significantly with the Enochian Watchers and the broader concept of divine beings shaping humanity's fate. In Sumerian and Akkadian myth, humanity is crafted from mixtures of divine and earthly substances, and the gods who preside over human destiny often cross boundaries to directly interact with mortals. None of these traditions portray literal sexual hybridization in the later UFO sense, but they do encode a worldview in which human origins, traits, and kingship lineages, especially, derive from those who came down from the heavens. Double entendre, if you like. It is from this ancient intersection of Watchers, Nephilim, Anunnaki, SKYDADDIES, and primordial progenitors, creator gods, etc. The modern ancient astronaut theory, take a shot, draws its strongest material. Writers such as Eric von Daniken, Zecharia Sitchin, and a host of later popularizers reframed Enochian and Mesopotamian myths as literal records of alien intervention. In this reinterpretation, the Watchers become extraterrestrials, the Nephilim become genetic hybrids, and the forbidden knowledge of metals and celestial mechanics becomes technological uplift from advanced visitors. Although scholars overwhelmingly reject this as pseudo-history, boring, the narrative persists because it resonates with deep mythical structures already present in ancient texts. The idea that heavenly beings descended and altered humanity, whether through teaching, engineering, or reproduction, is not an invention of the 20th century. It's a reactivation and reinterpretation of a situation, of an ancient underlying concept. Modern ufology has further elaborated on this framework by drawing explicit parallels between early abduction accounts and the Enochian stories. The abductors, often tall, radiant, angelic, or fearsome, take humans aboard vessels that descend from the sky. They perform reproductive experiments, whatever that may entail, create hybrid offspring, and instruct their contactees in esoteric knowledge about the cosmos. Researchers such as Jacques Vallée have noted that these patterns closely mirror earlier folklore, suggesting that the phenomenon, whatever its source, expresses itself in culturally mediated forms. For some theorists, the Watchers narrative is the clearest ancient analog to contemporary hybrid lore, and the Nephilim become a template for the modern hybrid children reported in UFO contact traditions. Others, including Gillis and certain fringe demonologists, go further. They argue that the entities of today are the same class of beings described in ancient scripture. Not divine, not extraterrestrial, but intermediary intelligences whose interactions, we'll say, with humanity take forms interpreted variously as spirits, angels, demons, or extraterrestrials, depending on the cultural filters and framework. So in this reading, alien abductions become a modern vocabulary for a very ancient pattern of entity contact, especially focused on sexuality, soul theft, or reproductive manipulation. So as the ancient world transitioned into the monotheistic era, the old patterns of divine-human union did not disappear so much as they were reclassified. The gods of the ancient Near East, the Mediterranean, and Eurasia were reframed as angels, demons, or fallen intermediaries. Sky beings became watchers. Their offspring, once revered as culture heroes, demigods, or founding kings, progenitors of civilization, were recast as the Nephilim. The sexual unions that once conferred legitimacy, charisma, or sacred kingship became troubling, to say the least, transgressive, or outright diabolical. In this new framework, hybridization was no longer a sign of divine favor, but a violation of cosmic order. Yet the deeper mythical patterns survived, especially in the political imagination of Europe. The concept of the divine right of kings, the idea that a ruler's authority emanated from a supernatural source, quietly preserved the older logic of hybrid ancestry. Christian monarchs did not openly claim to be fathered by Zeus, obviously, or descended from dragon kings, as was occurring in the East, but they continued to assert a bloodline touched by the sacred, sanctioned by God, chosen through providence, set apart by a lineage that ordinary humans did not share. Genealogy became a theological instrument. Dynasties traced themselves back to biblical patriarchs, to heroic figures of antiquity, or to semi-mythical ancestors who bridged humanity to the supernatural. In the shadows of this official theology, folk genealogies preserved much older notions of interbreeding with non-human beings. Medieval Europe teemed with tales of noble families descended from mermaids, forest spirits, fairy queens, and shape-shifting monsters. The House of Lusignan claimed descent from Melusine, a serpentine water spirit whose marriage to a mortal lord produced a lineage of uncanny beauty and power. Frankish royal lore insisted that the Merovingians descended from the Quinator, the five-horned sea beast who supposedly assaulted and impregnated Queen Basina, an obvious echo of ancient hybrid myths repackaged as dynastic folklore. These stories persisted precisely because they filled the void that Christian theology left unaddressed. An instinctive, primordial belief that rulership is not merely political, but biological, that the right to govern comes from being other, from carrying a spark of something beyond ordinary humanity. This mixture of official doctrine and unofficial myth created a transitional landscape in which hybrid origin stories were neither fully rejected nor fully embraced, merely reinterpreted into new forms. Angels replaced gods, demons replaced trickster spirits, saints replaced local deities, and the supernatural ancestry of rulers migrated from explicitly divine parentage to whispers of legends and occult lineages and claims of special blood that quietly undergirded monarchy well into the modern era. That's right, it's still around. Even as the church condemned illicit unions between humans and spirits, Europe's kings and nobles preserved a symbolic memory of precisely such unions within their own family myths. And it's from this tension between public doctrine and private mythology, between Christian orthodoxy and pagan survivals, that the medieval imagination produced its next great generation of the hybrid concept. Sexual encounters with non-human entities, once the privilege of heroes and divine kings, reappear in the Middle Ages as cases of spiritual temptation, demonic seduction, or supernatural deception. The same acts that once produced demigods were now reframed as violations of the divine law. The same unions that once conferred sacred power were now thought to create changelings, witches, cambions, such as Merlin, or monstrous offspring. This is the doorway into the world of the Immaculate Conception as official doctrine. Thank you. Demonic sexuality and the elaborate demonologies of the later medieval era. where theologians debated not just whether incubi and succubi existed, but how they reproduced, how they collected seminal fluid, whether demons could father children, and whether the boundaries of flesh could ever truly be closed. It leads directly to the writings of one Ludovico Maria Sinistrari in his treatise on demon-human intercourse, to witchcraft trials where accusations of spectral sex were treated as evidence. The idea that demons could manipulate reproduction through cunning, deception, or technological means. To the growing belief that hybrid birth was no longer heroic myth, but spiritual threat. From divine kingship to demonic violation, from sacred genealogy to forbidden breeding, the mythical structure remains unchanged. Only its moral value shifts. It is in this shift that the medieval world reveals its deepest anxieties about blood, purity, lineage, and the flexibility of the human body. Double entendre if you like, once again. In the next episode, we will descend fully into that world. The doctrine of miraculous conception, the incubus and the succubus as theological problems, Sinistrari's sexual demonology, and the incredibly weird sodomy laws. Just to name a few. As well as the erotic underworld of medieval witchcraft, where the ancient hybridization myth survives in its most shadowed and forbidden form. Starting to get Alex Jones' voice.
I know, I get it, I killed them.
Please tune in next week, where we get into, I won't say it's the weirdest section of all this, but it's definitely going to take the weirdness level up a few notches. So check it out. I'm Mike Luck. This has been Kooks, Cranks, and Iconoclast, the podcast. Sexual Encounters with Non-Human Entities, Part 1. Science, Myth, and Folklore. Pre-Christian tradition. Be here next week for Part 2, where we'll be examining all this in the monotheistic worldview. Thanks for listening. Like and subscribe. Leave a comment. I really appreciate you guys. Thanks for listening, and really just thank you so much. You guys are fucking amazing. You're awesome, and I love everything about you. See you next week. Peace, y'all.
There's been a lot of talk about
The Kooks, Cranks, and Iconoclast podcast.
losing their heart. Hell? Well, we never had no hearts to lose to begin with.